Margaret, thank you very much. I look forward to the program today, and I'm delighted to see so many of you here. Let me just say that honorary chairman is one of my favorite titles, and being here with the Asia Society is one of my favorite things to do. The Asia Society has made a tremendous contribution over the years to our relationships in Asia, and particularly our relationship with China. First, let me ask a question. What is a guy who grew up in Kentucky and has a degree from the University of Chicago and spent 25 years in New York doing, talking about China? Well, I got to Asia in 1987 to start Morgan Stanley's business there. We landed in Tokyo. It became apparent very quickly that China was going to be extremely important even then, and I've always been fascinated by big ideas. I was struck then by the conventional wisdom that Japan was going to take over the world. There were books like Zero-Sum Game, and it didn't take me very long to reach the conclusion that the elements that make for great competition and growth were sorely lacking in Japan, but it didn't take me long to discover that the innovative energy, the scale, and the ambitions of China were going to make a big difference. And hence my feeling and my involvement with China. Let me talk about today a little bit. I have been very focused on trying to understand where China is going, and too much of the analysis about China has to do with what I call inputs. That is to say, trying to guess what's happening at the State Council, or trying to guess what's on Xi Jinping's mind. To me, a much more fruitful pursuit is to understand, analyze, and look at outputs. And I think we are in an era where that is possible in ways that it wasn't before. It's about data, it's about understanding data, it's about analyzing that data, and it's about using that understanding to have a view of the future. The Rhodium Group has been a central part of my trying to understand and deal with the importance, frankly, of outputs. And it's hard to believe, Dan and I were talking this morning. The first project we did together, I think, was 2011, how time passes. And ironically, that was called the open door sort of question mark for the United States, and it was about capital flows from China into the United States. And at that moment in time, there was a lot of conventional wisdom that CFIUS was holding up investments coming into the United States from China, and that there was a negative China attitude, not only in Washington, but among the public. And what that study proved, beyond the shadow of a doubt, was that neither were true. And of course, we then entered an era where Chinese investment into the United States surged, certainly not because of that report, but because of the analytics that were used to indicate, what the future was likely to look like. It didn't take us very long to conclude that we should do a similar study. China investment into the United States, and again, that had sort of a simple theme. It was about sending a message to China that U.S. investment into China. Sending a message that it would grow at a much more rapid rate if there were less regulation and there was a more open attitude toward U.S. investment into China, and that ended up being the so-called two-way street. And of course, we then entered a period where both data sets exploded, and here we are now where they've basically more or less collapsed. The next big study was about the third-party plenum, and that was called the Blind Alley. I love Dan has always got a name for his work. And of course, that was critical in the sense that it, is the microphone on? It gave us all tools to analyze the reform agenda for China. And we all know that the last 6 years have been rather disappointing in terms of that reform agenda. And now the final study in that category is called the Dashboard, which is about taking the main focus areas of reform and doing report cards once a quarter on how is China doing. These are the kind of outputs that to me help understand how to deal with China growing forward. And of course, I think Dan and his team have established a position in the industry as experts on China. And I would say there's barely a report written that doesn't cite some data from the Rhodium Group, which is a real tribute to that organization, Dan's team, and I think the impact will just simply grow. So it's a delight for me to have Dan here to talk about state-owned enterprise. And let me just say a bit about that. SOEs are a very, very important factor in the Chinese economy. When I started doing work in China in 1991, would you believe that 100% of the economy was more or less state-owned? And between 1991 and today, 100% of SOEs have been what we call privatized. Now, privatized in Chinese jargon is a little different from privatization in the rest of the world. It means that they only own 80% of the SOE category, which means that if you think about the market cap of the Chinese stock market, a very significant portion of it is basically owned by the Chinese government. And Dan and I have had a lot of discussions about this. At some point, this is a source, basically, of capital, for a country that doesn't have a problem with capital today, but to have the ownership be as high as it is in these publicly traded enterprises is a very significant difference between China and basically the rest of the world. So when we talk about governance, which is the subject for today, it's a very interesting dynamic. How do you actually talk about governance, when the principal shareholder still owns 80% of the company? This is a really important issue. It's one of the most, I think, important issues going forward. So reform in the SOE sector is something very, very important to watch and to understand. And governance can take a lot of forms. It's not just share ownership. But that is what this study is about, and I would guess, Dan, like so many of the rhodium studies, there'll be step 2 and step 3 and step 4. We'll probably think them up tonight over dinner. But, I mean, to me, the share ownership is a huge question, and there have been some attempts to sell down, but not much, and so on. So this, by way of background, is why I think the SOE study is so important. And Dan, over to you.
Jack, thank you so very much for that introduction and for all you've done to permit us to do more of what we've done with Asia Society. Margaret, thank you so much. Melissa, for your help getting this one put together. Ken. Rhodium does a mix of talking to people in the private sector and putting a lot of time into trying to make a contribution to the public policy debate around China and China and the United States. This study in particular involved not just me, but women named Wendy Littert and Shan Guo. Shan's at Rhodium Group. Wendy is at Harvard and Columbia right now, is one of the best PhD level experts on corporate governance out there. And we couldn't have pulled this study together without them, but we couldn't have put it together without you, Jack, Margaret, without you and Asia Society and what we're doing here together, what we've done in the past and what we look forward to doing more of. State-owned enterprises, and within that, the question of how corporate governance is supposed to work for them is just one of many structural issues that are of first-order importance today in trying to understand where China is going, where China and the rest of the world are going. This year, these structural issues have become a central, the center of conflict and tension, first between China and the United States, but now there are many other advanced economies around the world that are joining into this debate and conversation about what kinds of structural changes are going to be required in China in order for us to have a shared future together. The SOE question is a very, very big one, and how they are governed. As Jack noted, corporate governance is a complicated, rich world kind of thing to talk about and deal with. But China is not a poor developing country anymore. It's the second largest economy in the world. In most people's projections, soon to be the largest, very much at middle income level already. And the corporate governance that has been used in the past to try to manage what China's state-owned enterprises do is got one foot in the past and one foot in the future. Some elements of how governance works are concerned with the political role of the state sector. Others are very much centered on trying to make them more modern, efficient firms that will be sustainable and create economic welfare out into the future, not just political handles that the party and the government can hold on to. Why is this topic so important to us all here today? There are a number of theories of that on this very first slide. I'm going to spend a minute on this slide and then move a little faster. Much too much material in the study than we can roll out in my little remarks here up front, but between me, my conversation with my good friend Vic, and then the panel, we're going to be able to give much of this an airing. First of all, how the state-owned enterprises are governed, how corporate governance works in China is going to define what China's speed limit is for its macroeconomic growth out into the future. And that is because this sector still soaks up such a large share of the resources in the economy, in the system, that whether you get governance right or wrong is going to be a giant factor in determining whether China can grow at 6% on average over the next 5 years, or whether that's necessarily going to be much slower than that. And we'll come back to that in a minute. Secondly, for those of us who have a special interest in capital markets, stock markets, debt markets, how corporate governance works for the state-owned enterprises is probably the crucial determinant of how China's capital market future looks. Whether it'll continue to be a bank-dominated system where growing the economy depends mostly on loans from bankers, or whether capital markets, equity markets, debt markets can play a larger role. Right now, those capital markets are too busy worrying about the fragilities in the state sector to really be as dynamic as they can be and play the role they'll need to play in the future. Thirdly, corporate governance is essential to a particular set of people interested in capital markets, foreign investors, who might be interested in what their position in China is going to be for the years and decades to come. In fact, I think, if I remember correctly, Jack, the topic of this report first came up in a conversation you and I had. We were talking about how much savings wanted to get out of China, not because it was necessarily capital flight, just because you don't want to have 100% of your whole life savings in a single emerging market, even if that's China. And we know Chinese corporations wanted to have a bigger corporate footprint as foreign direct investors outside China around the world where so many of their consumers are. So the outflows are kind of hardwired. Well, the inflows should be just as exciting, right? I mean, every wealth manager on the planet should want to have exposure where 25% or more of global marginal growth will be in the decades ahead. But of course, being in the West, we have fiduciary responsibilities to our shareholders, and there needs to be governance changes backstopped by rule of law and predictability in order to get that balancing inflow of money into China as large as the hardwired impulse to move some amount of money out. And that's what we identified. We said, well, So, okay, all we have to do is fix corporate governance. How hard can this be? And that brings us to our report here today. Since that time, we first started talking about that, we now have another first-order reason to be profoundly interested and concerned with this topic of Chinese corporate governance, because the special treatment that SOEs have been afforded in China has become one of the major casus belli, one of the theories of the threat from China that Washington, Brussels, Berlin, London, Paris, Canberra, many others are saying, you know, we're not willing to just go with business as usual. There have to be some changes to how these SOEs work, or we can't just say, well, okay, come on over and, you know, get around to opening the door to our companies as soon as you can, please, right? That era has now ended. And until the governance issues we're talking about are resolved, we're not really going to create the basis to rebuild trust and enthusiasm about China's opportunity for us in the world economies. Finally, though, at the same time we think of all those legitimate reasons why we should be concerned about, interested in the state of corporate governance today, we have to recognize that China is not the United States or any other OECD economy. And the state companies play additional important social roles in China that's not necessarily unacceptable or wrong. It's just very different. And so how China addresses its corporate governance challenges can't just be Hong Kong's or Singapore's model for how you do that. The SOEs are going to be different. China's going to have a somewhat different approach to this for a long time to come. Our challenge as being participants in the non-Chinese debate is, are we comfortable with those differences at the end of the day? Are they reasonable and compatible with what we need governance to do for these state companies? Or are we not ready to accept that China's approach to this is okay? Bottom line, few of China's many reform goals is as central and core to what we can do together in the years ahead than how China deals with the questions of corporate governance in its state sector. So there's the chart here, since we only have the one screen there, and it's not the Megatron that this would be. Y'all won't be able to see all those charts, every line in detail. You've got it all in your report, though. Let me just point out what a few of these things is. On the upper left there, that's the share of total industrial assets in China by ownership. So that blue line at the top is what the SOEs were starting over on the left in 2002. More than 60% of all the industrial assets in the country were state-owned enterprise assets. That's moving back toward Jack's childhood, when he arrived in a China that was pretty much entirely a state-owned story. And you can see the first half of the chart that takes us to 2017 was pretty exciting stuff. The question wasn't, has China completely converged with the United States or anybody else in the OECD, advanced economies? It's, is it moving decisively in the right direction? And the answer was absolutely it is. No other emerging market had put its money where its mouth was by selling down so much of its state position so quickly, including, if you like, Italy and France and some other variants of the advanced economy model, where they had taken a lot longer and had to get much wealthier before they were ready to sell down, you know, Alitalia, if you will, and the U.S. Postal Service, if you want to go even further. The problem with that chart is that it's flattened out a lot. And today, that state withdrawal from having that dominant share in the system is only kind of pulling back at a crawl, if you will. And by some metrics, it's actually going in the wrong direction. And so, whereas we didn't have to have a really deep dive discussion about whether corporate governance was adequate in China in 2006 or in 2000 when I was at the White House helping China get into the WTO, we now actually do have to have that conversation because the trends have changed. A couple other things in this array of charts I want to pull your attention to. Let me just point to the one at the bottom left, which shows us leverage, debt of industrial enterprises in China by ownership. Again, the blue line is state-owned enterprises, and the green line is private, purely private companies in China. Now, that leaves all sorts of intermediate firms out of the picture. But the point of this one is that the ratio of liabilities to assets for Chinese SOEs wasn't always what it was today. We don't have the same problem in China SOEs with debt and leverage today that we had 5 or 6 years ago. 5 or 6 years ago, it was not as bad. The problem was getting resolved. The problem of too much debt going to state companies that didn't have governance designed to maximize shareholder wealth and profitability that problem was resolving itself. Over the past decade, things have moved back in a very different direction and are kind of moving sideways now. And that's why, again, why we have to talk about this stuff. So the numbers tell a very clear and powerful story. Let me make it even starker for you, and even with a small screen, I think you all can pretty much see this. We look at state-owned enterprises' weight in the Chinese system, the economy. In the industrial sector on the left, they're 5%, only 5% of the number of firms in China today are SOEs, but 28% of the assets still are, and 16% of all the revenue generated in the country. Gets a little bit more scary when we look at the A-share market, the equity markets in China, where state enterprises make up 31% of all those listed companies, but they make up 61% of all the market capitalization of the Chinese exchange and 71% of all the revenue in the Chinese stock exchange. So you can't be in the Chinese stock exchange without being an SOE investor, right? Unless you're just going to try to cherry pick out the private firms. And if you want to think about the exciting prospect for MSCI inclusion of China being listed as part of Morgan Stanley's index for emerging Asia, MSCI China, 65% of all the firms in it are SOEs. 83% of all the revenue to be found in the MSCI universe is SOE revenue. So the MSCI issues are SOE issues, like it or not. I'm going to move very quickly through the rest of the slides and then finish up. I think I only have 2 minutes. Is that 2 minutes to the 15-minute mark or to the 20-minute mark? To the end. To the end. Very good. So look, part of the issue here is just how complicated the structure and the politics are in China around how SOEs work. Bottom line, SOEs have many masters telling them what to do. Do I optimize for politics and security, stability, or do I optimize for profit for the shareholders? The current system is a halfway compromise approach to that that's really solving for neither of those things adequately. Establishing boards of directors, the most core, simple aspect of installing corporate governance in the system. A lot of progress been made at the company group level, which is the top level central state-owned enterprise holding companies. 80% now have boards of directors. So that's not the right question. Are there boards of directors? The question is, are those board of directors independent? Can they do what they're supposed to do to make sure that the outcome at the end of the day is that these institutions are being operated for profitability and shareholder value and not some mix of other considerations? And do the boards of directors really have control over things like appointing management, deciding their compensation? Today, they do not. In fact, there are 3 overlapping layers of control for the SOEs. The board of directors is just one of them. Increasingly today, we have party committees that used to have responsibility only to think about personnel and propaganda being enshrined now in the Articles of Incorporation for all SOEs, that they're going to look at all major business commercial decisions before those decisions are even sent to the board of directors for consideration. So governance is getting murkier, not clearer here. We look in the study at one case in particular, Bao Steel, which, for those folks who follow corporate governance, one of their favorite Chinese companies, it's taken corporate governance more seriously than almost any other firm. And yet what you'll see when you read through the report and look at how it's being treated by the markets, it's actually being priced in terms of its PE ratios and other indicators at beneath the rest of the steel industry listed universe in China. So governance is being treated as a negative in terms of shareholders' welfare rather than a positive as we need it to if we're going to really make this a $1 trillion investment opportunity in the years ahead. Good news is there's lots of fairly low-hanging fruit that can be picked to improve the corporate governance picture, from limiting overlap between boards of directors and party committees to appointing more external and independent directors. But those things are going to need major political commitment from the top in order to happen. It's not up to the SOEs right now. It's up to the Standing Committee of the Politburo to decide that that's the priority. The benefits of this, though, are going to be more than worth it in terms of the efficiency these firms can generate, their ability to attract literally trillions of dollars of global capital to go long on China in the years ahead, and the role that would play in helping to tamp down and resolve some of these really quite scary tensions and trade wars and other battles with advanced economies around the world. Hope you enjoyed that quick first shotgun look at the study. I'm very excited to talk to my friends and colleagues about it the rest of the morning. Thank you.
So first of all, thank you, Asia Society, for inviting me. It's always great to be in San Francisco, and also give me an advanced look of this very impressive report on state-owned enterprises. I think, obviously, as the U.S. government pays more attention to Chinese industrial policy, there's this tendency to sort of mystify what China is doing, and this report with Dan and also Wendy's, great expertise on this topic. Dan, of course, has looked at the macroeconomy and the financial system in China for a number of years, as well as state-owned and also private investors into the U.S. For a number of years, and Wendy, being an expert on SOEs from the inside out. She, of course, worked in a state-owned enterprise for a number of years. So this, for those of you in the audience, I urge you to read the report. It's very informative. It tells you the inside operation and the trends, the important trends in the state-owned economy in China. So I just have a few questions for you. One is that I think you pointed out in your report that SOEs, by almost design, they don't just serve to maximize profit, right? So they also serve a number of other objectives. We know this counter-cyclical investment very well, which is what the SOEs played a big role in 2008, 2009 in stabilizing China's economy. So at what point would you say this kind of other functions of the SOEs is almost kind of harmful for the long-term, viability of the state sector? And at what point, does China need to inject more corporate governance reform? Or do you see that as not necessarily incompatible, that even with corporate governance reform, as you outline, the SOEs can still serve many of these other functions?
Thank you, Vic. I guess the first question we have to ask is, to the extent that the state enterprises are being used as an alternative way to deal with these other social objectives, are they actually doing that very well? The SOEs are creating zero employment growth in the economy. All of the employment growth in China is coming out of the private sector. So one often hears officials and friends in China talk about the important role that SOEs play in terms of welfare and employment policy dynamics, but that's actually not something they're doing. In terms of their counter-cyclical role in helping to smooth off business cycles, I guess we can say that given that for 20 or more straight quarters, China has reported that it hasn't deviated more than 0.1% from the same GDP growth number. I guess they're accomplishing that objective of smoothing the business cycle by using their control on the throttle of the economy largely through SOEs in many cases with infrastructure investment. But is that a good thing? Isn't there a role that winter plays, right? The seasons play in our economies. During the down times, that's when you figure out which of your investments were the ones you shouldn't have made in the first place. And you go ahead and work them out shut them down, write them off, so that capital can be redeployed to more productive purposes. One of the charts I didn't have time to go into in much depth was the return on assets that we see in the state sector versus the private sector from all that debt, from all that borrowing. And private firms are generating all the returns in China. SOEs, very, very little of that, which means there's less wherewithal for tomorrow's investment cycle and the day after and the day after. So this semblance of a positive contribution to the GDP outlook that has come from the state's control over the SOEs has actually relied on running debt to GDP up to close to 300% today. And the urgent necessity to start to put a ceiling on that this year in 2018 has now created all this anxiety about whether China is really in trouble due to deleveraging. So I'm not sure we've really established well that this role of the SOEs is actually in China's interest to perpetuate further out into the future. Some of these sectors, by the way, I'm not going to blame anybody for keeping the state as the dominant presence in state grid, for example, electric power distribution, right? Given the Enron experience in America, it's a little hard to second guess that one. In others, like amusement parks and property and tourism agencies, I'm just not convinced that I understand the urgency of having those be state sectors.
What would you say about banks?
Banks are playing a very multifunctional role in China today, right? None of them can really stand on their own in a global context where the normal pressures of the marketplace are applied. And it's actually quite worrisome. People's Bank came out about 48 hours ago with its financial stability report, which it does annually. I don't know if you've had a chance to dig through it yet, Vic. You're the guy who might have, because you've done incredible work on this. But the People's Bank ran a stress test around how their banks would do if growth were not permanently forever at 6.8136%. And what they found was that non-performing loan ratios at the banks could go up as much as 700%. This is public, and this is in the PBOC's current report out for the past 2 days in Chinese. So it'll be slow to make its way into the Bloombergs. But those banks are they're not ready to deal with the realities of the global economy that are still being held at bay. And as long as those forces are held at bay, the efficiency of the Chinese system and its future potential are what's going to pay the price, which is where we are.
For the banks, I mean, I almost think that it's too late, right? Like they're in so much trouble. I mean, as different people believe in different things. I happen to believe that a large share of their assets already are de facto non-performing, and it's purely sustained by this evergreening process that's supported by the PBOC. And if they were to introduce, some form of privatization, a lot of outside board members who actually take a real look at the books, it'd be like, oh my Lord, what is happening here? Well, why not just keep the whole thing going and then keep it more or less state-owned and onward you go, right?
Right.
And that applies to some of the larger SOEs too, right?
Well, I mean, if the typical business as usual from the past 10 years could be perpetuated for another 10 or 20 years, then I think that would probably happen, right? The problem is, even right now, we're seeing the limits of just evergreening and rolling this whole thing over ad infinitum, right? The private sector in China right now, there's not enough new credit to go around for everybody. So the SOEs are still getting enough to stay solvent, but many, many private firms, including property developers and tech companies, what have you, are really nearing the end of their ability to keep their books going right now. So I don't think business as usual can be continued here for very much longer.
I agree with you, actually.
Well, let me mention one other thing, though. But the good news is that unlike the United States, which only has the postal system to sell off, and this is part of the point of the report, that once China decides that it's time to make a really significant break with business as usual, and that they can't just perpetuate more of the same, there actually is a pathway forward, right, that works, that at least potentially, can work. And corporate governance is core to that. By resetting governance expectations, we start to do the hard work of deciding which of those state-owned enterprises should be shut down, because we're asking the right way. Where would the shareholders actually stay put if they were given a choice? Which ones can be restructured, and it may be a bloodletting for the current shareholders, but you could get hundreds of billions of dollars of new money in from abroad, from Chinese investors at home, if you address the governance reasons to be a little skeptical and wait on the sidelines right now. So there are tremendous assets that can be put to work, restructured, worked out, and a lot of this problem of liability can be resolved and worked out. There's probably no Chinese future that is 6.8% average GDP growth, but we don't at all necessarily have a crisis on our hands either. But there's not very much time, and a different approach to governance as it relates to these companies has got to be core to a breakpoint and a new path going forward.
The other question I have, and I think the report addresses it to some extent. So China remains a one-party state, and that's a fact on the ground, if you will. And of course, for the state, the one-party state, overriding objective is to control, many aspects of the economy and society, and that's part of the reason why they have these party committees. In every state-owned corporations and increasingly even some of the private and foreign-owned companies. Basically, what sorts of governance reform, corporate governance reform, would you say is realistic given this backdrop of a one-party state and the party's desire to be everywhere, or as many places as possible?
Vic, I think the party's own definition of what role the party should play in the commercial sector has bounced around a lot over the years. It hasn't been constant, right? It's changed with conditions and circumstances and new ideas coming into China, and then some of those new ideas turning out to be problematic, as we saw in our financial crisis here. And some of the faith that had been put into the Anglo-American model of financial capitalism, lost some of its legs under it, and folks were tempted to look back in a different direction for more administrative control through the parties of the corporate sector, rather than relying on the market to do more of that work. But look, the reality is that there are really hard business decisions to be made where party committees just don't have competence to make those decisions. There are political decisions that need to be made too, but are corporations the right place to try to pursue political objectives? I've already argued that they're not a very efficient way to affect social policies, political policies in China, and that there's not enough transparency to recognize that companies just aren't playing that great a role, SOEs, at trying to provide some of those social goods that are entirely reasonable for any nation to want to provide. But this mode of thinking that the SOEs can do it is just not really working as well as some people think when you're honest about how things are actually going today. So the short answer to your question, transparency in terms of how governance is working, what the conversations sound like, who's involved, and how the shareholders' interest is being represented in how SOEs are making their choices. Transparency, number one. Dealing with the ambiguity in the roles for the party committee and the board of directors. Who really is supposed to make decisions about management? Who should be managing these firms? And what is the appropriate role of the party? Most folks were willing to grant over the past 6 years, the Xi Jinping era, that turned out there was a corruption imperative to have some more supervision. And maybe the party was the right vehicle to impose that kind of supervision and cleanup on the state-owned enterprises. That's very different than coming up with business strategies, deciding how much companies should want to support the Belt and Road program, which is inherently political undertaking and shouldn't be done just based on politics, but should be a company by company decision whether you want to get on board with that. So distinguishing the roles of these different bodies, party committee and board of directors, critically important, along with transparency. And then finally, I could keep going on. There's a couple other ideas in the report, but checks and balances, right? Having some separation of power that is backstopped by the rule of law, so that the board of directors, independent and external board members, need to fear joint and several liability for the outcome of the firm if they do not actively pursue the interests of the shareholders, right? There are too often a lack of checks and balances on the choices that people make in management and at the board. Yeah,
so that also then pertains to the larger environment, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But one issue I want to push you on is on personnel, right? So the party still more or less insists that it controls the management. Do you think that's something that should be changed? You know, in your version of corporate governance reform, top management then should be beholden to the board and to shareholders instead of the party committee?
I think by China's own discussion of this issue since 1992, when it first became a priority in Beijing to address the needs of corporate governance for modern enterprises that were going to play a different role in China's future than the SOEs had played in the past. Ever since that time, the necessity to have company leadership who had the right skills to make terribly complicated and hard business decisions in a rapidly moving, evolving, reforming economy, right, was an imperative. In recent years, as the state has leaned in more to provide guidance on how big each sector of the economy should be 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, right? It has shifted the focus away from making good company decisions toward having company leaders who knew what the political decisions were and hence could put their company in the right place to benefit from where the political winds are blowing. Those political winds are never going to be as efficient as a dynamic marketplace can be, right? Ultimately, it's for each sovereign country to decide how much efficiency and welfare it's willing to trade off against the prospect of political stability, right? But even if you go 100% for political stability, as China did in some ways in the distant past, that's no guarantee you're actually going to get it. Because what the needs are of increasingly wealthy, well-educated, skilled, mobile Chinese people and citizens, many of you in this room who've already made the choice to vote to be in a more dynamic economy rather than take your chances with what the political bodies thought was an adequate amount of opportunity for you in the future at home. So it's got to start with a decision about what's the role of companies. Is it a social policy vehicle by another name, or is it about discovering how to be profitable and productive and efficient for commercial purposes, right? There's always going to be some industries which are going to be treated as purely political in nature, but great majority of those which have a heavy SOE footprint in China today, there's really not much case that that's the best way to look after the country's future.
Yeah, and I would add that a problem with having political or policy objectives for companies is that it leads to a lot of opportunism, where people within the company will say, oh, you know, the government wants to do this and is throwing all these resources at this certain thing. Like, you know, of course, Belt and Road being the perfect example. Let's take advantage of that, do something that maybe we don't even have an expertise in, but then that we can win some kind of state subsidies, et cetera, et cetera. And this is how the debt, you know, part of the mechanism of how the debt level gets built up, you know, to be so high in China. I think it's a lot of SOE opportunism. So I agree with you on that point. I think the report raises a very good point that corporate governance reform will go a long way in helping foreign investors as they consider buying directly into the A-share market. And also, of course, the Chinese government wants to sell onshore bonds also to foreign investors. But I think for foreign investors, what other sort of institutional or other larger considerations do they have as they think about investing directly into A-share or directly into renminbi bonds that are issued onshore in China?
Look, even if it weren't for this whole set of corporate governance issues, a rapidly growing emerging market is always going to be higher risk investment space than a mature advanced economy where things change very little and you mostly have mature incumbents in the economy. So, that kind of risk and volatility is the nature of the game, and it's not a bad thing. That's where people discover ways of making things better, where there's still a lot of change taking place. It's this additional layer of uncertainty about what kind of system this is going to be, right? What's the fundamental purpose of these companies? How are shareholders going to be treated compared to the interests of the party and insiders at the firm and all these other kinds of considerations? That's the part which, if it's hard to be an EM investor in the first place, it just becomes unacceptably difficult once you add that whole layer of complexity on top of it. And, at the end of the day, this notion that the party can step in and provide governance itself directly, administratively, is kind of an excuse not to deal with the larger rule of law issues, isn't it? Right? I mean, ultimately, you're going to have a predictable system of law. There's going to be shareholders who feel like insiders mistreated them. That happens in America every day. Thousands of cases get lodged alleging some kind of misdealing. That's not failure. That's the nature of capitalism and a market economy, right? What you need is predictability, that you've got rules and you've got a legal system that can help work all that out so people still take chances at the end of the day. And the party's readiness to reach in is not an adequate substitute for that hard work that needs to come.
Yeah, so as I was reading your report, it does seem to me that some kind of legal reform would be sort of good to happen in tandem with the corporate governance reform that you suggest, right? Because if you have better corporate governance and then some kind of malfeasance were to be discovered, people have to be able to sue and believe that the court system is going to treat their lawsuits fairly, right, in some sense.
Certainly seems that way to me. So, in the report, it's not a detailed legal treatise on how we would re-legislate and re-regulate every aspect of this. We focus on the high-level outcomes and goals of the whole thing here, right? That you need to separate between what the party is trying to do and the role of the power and authority of the board of directors to take responsibility for decisions that are made. How you're going to backstop that in the Chinese legal system, it's done very differently in Britain than it is in the United States, right? The way we use precedent law here to settle these, we're going to talk about this forever. As Jack said, this is the big sort of, big ideas starting point if people want to engage the question of what kind of an SOE conversation is necessary to get us where we want to go. And let's not forget, the idea here is that naturally there should be, I would say roughly about $4 to $6 trillion of global portfolio capital into China now to 2030. That would be in a natural state of things. If we didn't have these problems, we'd be talking about that order of magnitude of cross-border capital into China. From portfolio investment, everyone from CalPERS to Ontario Teach to Fidelity to on and on and on and on down the list. Marcia is going to be on the panel from who spent years thinking about these things. But that money will be moving up too steep a hill if we don't address these corporate governance problems. So there's a big payoff at the end of the arduous challenge and task ahead of us. It's worth it. We need to get there. A lot of details and the modalities needed to open up that channel for that to flow.
And more importantly, foreign investors are interested. They do want to invest more directly in China. So the question I want to ask you now is, as you know, China is switching there has been some SOE reform, and the biggest move that I have seen is instead of having SASAC be, the ultimate owner of a lot of these companies, China is giving the ownership stakes over to these sectoral funds. Of course, originally started with the Social Security Fund, and then China Development Bank had a fund, and then now all the provinces and even some of the ministries have their funds for specific sectors. Do you see that as an important kind of step forward in the direction that you want to see, or do you see that as sort of the same thing as status quo?
State-owned capital management companies, part of this. It could be an effective way to work out some of the SOEs that we're talking about, right? There's going to be in other cases, you're just going to want to outright corporatize or privatize firms. In some cases, you're going to want to merge them or shut them down, right? And in other cases, you're going to want to say, let's stop kidding around. We're going to keep this one in the state's hands forever. And that's just the decision we're going to make for national security reasons, or you name it. But in each and every one of those cases, there's the same general purpose application of corporate governance, that no matter what the specific pathway for trying to rework the shareholding structure and the capital structure of these firms, you're going to want a board of directors separate from management and separate from a party committee looking at the operational efficiency, the profitability at the end of the day of the enterprise, so that you can maximize that, right? The state the state gets dividend up to 25% from many of these centrally owned companies. They have as compelling an interest as anybody else in trying to improve the efficiency with which these firms use money. And the money they're using is usually debt, right? Not only the efficiency with which they use that money to produce a profit for the shareholder, including the government, right? But minimizing the risk that the government's going to get left with trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars of liability at the end of the day, which nobody has an answer for how to maintain stability. At the same time, you start getting transparent about it and turning to work it out.
I mean, from what I've seen, actually, I would say it's a step forward, because even though a lot of these funds are parts of the Chinese government, also they have their own performance metrics, which are things like profit and returns and stuff like that, and so they actually will get into fights with the original management to get them to do things that are more market oriented. So let's shift gear a little bit to talk about U.S. and China and where your report sits in the emerging conflict between the United States and China. So one thing that I was thinking is that I can imagine, even with foreign shareholders and foreigners who are on the board of directors of some of these large SOEs, they would also like free money from the Chinese government. Why not, right? So, what the U.S. accuses China of doing is, industrial policy, subsidies and stuff. From a pure profit sort of perspective, that's a good thing for almost, any investors, regardless of nationality. Would sort of introduction of let's say foreign board members, outside experts as board members, necessarily sort of close the gap between the United States and China in terms of industrial policies?
I don't know. I mean, I think there's different investors out here, Vic. Some are looking for that kind of anticipatable short or medium-term payoff from letting these kinds of policies run and just timing it and knowing when, you've made enough to kind of get out of that. But I think when I use numbers, in the 1, 2, 3, 4 or more trillion dollars to describe the potential global flow of capital into China, the vast bulk of that is very long money, right? That has a different kind of DNA about what it's looking to be exposed to. And it is so labor intensive to try to wheedle your way into the politics enough to know which way things are going to break, right or left, if you're just trying to game where the political winds are blowing, right? That it's impossible to do that with so much investment, with so much portfolio capital. Ultimately, we have to go back to more of a fundamentals kind of investment premise for China's long-term future if we really want to see that much money deploy into the opportunities there. After all, at the beginning of 2018, we had Xi Jinping at Davos really presenting an extraordinary picture of China's global role, taking the banner of internationalism from the United States, dropping it. And as this year comes to a close, there's a very different conversation taking place about the sustainability of how things are going in the Chinese model at home. So that kind of, even within a year, fundamental shift of the betting in terms of how much legs this Chinese model has to it, that's just, it's never going to be able to mobilize as much capital as we saw mobilize over the past 40 years, where people weren't sure about the timing, complete opposite of what I just said. Can't be sure about the short-term timing, but we were pretty sure where China was headed in the longer run, and it was the right direction. We've lost that confidence to a considerable extent. It can be refounded and reestablished, but it's going to take the really hard work of fully implementing things like a modern corporate governance system in order to restore that kind of enthusiasm for the long term.
So you think basically corporate governance reform in China would almost have an effect on policymakers in the U.S. or maybe even Europe and Japan? What aspect of this? Let's say the U.S. as an example, what aspect of the emerging tension would corporate governance reform address that is not being addressed right now currently?
For one thing, right, not just in the United States, but in the European Union and most of the rest of the advanced economy set, the China Made in China 2025 industrial policy program is being treated as prima facie evidence of distortion, subsidization, unfair treatment of Chinese enterprises, not just SOEs, but largely SOEs, versus foreign companies, right? And so we're in the process now of seeing new trade and investment policies created throughout the advanced economies. It's not just a Trump phenomenon, and it's not just an American phenomenon anymore, designed to offset any such advantage being conferred on Chinese firms in those industries. So once they go abroad now, firms which were previously betting that since they were covered by Made in China 2025, they were in an advantageous position. As soon as they set foot abroad, they can find that that is carrying an original sin with it that's going to put them in a disadvantageous position. That's problematic for their partners here in the US or Europe. They're partnering with them and hoping to work together jointly on a global basis. It's problematic for investors who can't be sure that they have properly valued the long-term potential of these, even the most promising, excellent Chinese companies, that was all predicated on their ability to export and go abroad, right? So that is at its heart a discussion about what are the various corporate governance realities that shape how Chinese companies operate and how that operation is going to affect the interests of our companies and our economies over here. And until you untie this knot and get back to a sense that, okay, it's transparent enough, we actually know what they're doing over there. It's not being hidden from us in some closed back room. And now that we can see the way they're doing it, we're comfortable that it's compatible with our approaches to how the AI sector is going to grow, which Margaret's getting ready to do work on here at Asia Society. Those are all going to be conflicted industries where we can't realize our mutual cooperative opportunities until we settle all this.
Yeah, I agree. So the transparency is an important step, but the subsidies, you can be very transparent about your subsidies also, right? And that would still be the problem for the United States and other countries, would you say? Like if China provide a lot of transparency, it's like, indeed, for robotics company, in fact, they are kind of transparent about that, actually. We're going to give them, whatever, $50 billion in subsidies this year. Or that.
Yeah. Look, I would kind of use the same approach to this that I mentioned a second ago. Even without all this murkiness around China's ability to implement its own corporate governance reforms. Because keep in mind, almost nothing I've described here is an American idea set being forced into China. China decided, the CSRC decided, the State Council decided, the leadership decided over the past decades that they needed a more modern enterprise corporate governance regime. Otherwise, they were going to wind up with too much debt in SOE firms that weren't generating much return on their assets. Lo and behold, that's what's happened because they have not sufficiently implemented that goal. But even without all the corporate governance stuff, of course we would be and will be battling with Beijing over what's an appropriate subsidy for the AI sector and what's not. We're going to have those battles with Canada, as you may have noticed the past 2 years. Not everything is settled with our neighbors to the north, let alone with a non-democratic, authoritarian capitalism, China, with a demonstrated inability to implement its own reform and liberalization objectives, right? So just because we fix this corporate governance stuff doesn't mean we're done having debates and arguments and WTO disputes and cases. But that's okay. That's the system we designed. We designed it to handle that. There's going to be disputes. Just like having a good market economy in America doesn't mean nobody ever goes to court in a dispute over a patent or over a trade secret or over anything else.
So I think that's a very positive note to end on this conversation, and we can move to a larger discussion with the other panelists. Thank you, Dan.
Vic, thanks so much.